Welcome to Biblical Journey, where we dive deep into the stories that have shaped the faith of millions. Before we embark on today's journey through the incredible life of Moses, I want to ask you, have you ever faced a situation so impossible, so insurmountable, that you felt like giving up? Have you ever questioned your own worth, or wondered if you were capable of achieving something bigger than yourself? Well, you're not alone. This is a story about faith, perseverance, and the unbelievable ways in which God uses ordinary people to accomplish His extraordinary plans. We're about to dive into the life of Moses, a man who went from being a prince in the palace to a prophet leading millions to freedom. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on the bell icon so you never miss another life-changing story like this. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. And as we go through Moses' journey, I'd love to hear from you. Which part of Moses' story resonates with you the most? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. The land of Egypt was once a place of honor for the Hebrews, but as time passed, a new pharaoh arose who did not remember the man Joseph and the help he had once given Egypt. As the Hebrews multiplied, Pharaoh grew afraid of them. His solution? Enslave them. Hard labor from dawn till dusk, but even in the face of this suffering, the Hebrews grew stronger. In a desperate attempt to control their population, Pharaoh ordered that every newborn Hebrew boy be cast into the Nile River to drown. Imagine being in this world, where your very existence is considered a threat, the cries of mothers in despair. And yet, even in the darkest hour, a light shines through. A baby boy was born to a Hebrew woman named Jochebed. She looked into his tiny face, and though her heart was filled with fear, it was also filled with love. She knew that Pharaoh's law would mean the death of her son, but she refused to let that happen. For 3 months, she hid him from the soldiers, but as time went on, it became harder. So she came up with a dangerous but hopeful plan. She placed the baby into a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River. But Jochebed's faith was unshaken. She trusted that God would provide. Little did she know, this tiny baby, whose life was meant to end, was about to change the course of history. Moses' fate took a turn when Pharaoh's daughter discovered him in the reeds. She saw the baby, and despite knowing the law, something moved within her. She took Moses in, adopting him as her own. This child who was destined for death became a prince in Egypt. But Moses never forgot his roots. Deep down, he knew he was different. He was a Hebrew, and his people were still suffering under Pharaoh's cruel oppression. The question was, how long would he ignore their pain? Years passed, and Moses grew up in the palace, surrounded by luxury and power. But one day, while walking among the Hebrews, he witnessed something that would shake him to his core. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew man. Moses couldn't stand by any longer. He struck the Egyptian down and buried him in the sand. He had killed a man in defense of his people, but it was an impulsive act. The next day, when Moses tried to intervene in a quarrel between 2 Hebrews, one of them retorted, "Will you kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The word was out. Pharaoh heard of Moses' crime and sought to have him killed. Moses fled Egypt, leaving behind his life of privilege, now a fugitive in a land far from his past. In the wilderness, Moses found refuge in Midian. Here, he met Jethro, a priest, and his daughters. Moses married Zipporah, and for years he lived a humble life as a shepherd. But God wasn't done with Moses yet. His true calling had only just begun. Moses' life was about to change forever. One day, while tending to his flock, he came across a strange sight, a bush on fire, yet it wasn't consumed by the flames. As he approached, a voice called out to him, "Moses! Moses!" "Here I am," Moses responded. The voice from the bush revealed itself as the voice of God. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," it said. God had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, and he was sending Moses to deliver them. "You will go to Pharaoh, and you will bring my people out of Egypt." Moses hesitated. He felt unworthy. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" he asked. But God reassured him, "I will be with you." Still, Moses doubted. "What if they don't believe me?" God gave Moses signs to show the people. His staff turned into a serpent and back into a staff. His hand became leprous and then healed. And yet Moses still resisted. "I am not eloquent," he said, but God told him that he would help him speak. Even so, Moses pleaded, "Lord, please send someone else." But God was patient, yet firm. "Your brother Aaron will speak for you, but you will go." Moses reluctantly agreed. He was about to face Pharaoh, and he didn't know if he was ready. But God had chosen him, and he would see him through. Moses, now accompanied by his brother Aaron, returned to Egypt. The mighty palaces and golden streets that once symbolized his life were now a distant memory. But now Moses had a purpose. He wasn't returning as a prince, but as the chosen leader of God's people. The two brothers went before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at the time, and delivered a message that would shake Egypt to its very core. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: Let my people go." Pharaoh's response was swift and harsh. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh, consumed by pride and fear of losing his slaves, refused to listen. And so began a fierce battle, not between Moses and Pharaoh, but between Pharaoh's stubbornness and the unstoppable will of God. God's response to Pharaoh's refusal was swift and terrifying. He unleashed a series of plagues upon Egypt, each one more devastating than the last, to show Pharaoh his power and convince him to let his people go. The Nile turns to blood. The once life-giving river turned to blood, rendering it undrinkable. The fish died, and a foul stench filled the land. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. Frogs everywhere. Frogs invaded every part of Egypt. They filled the homes, the beds, the ovens. Pharaoh begged Moses to pray to God and make the frogs disappear. But once the frogs were gone, he hardened his heart again. Lice. The dust of the earth became lice that covered both people and animals. Even Pharaoh's magicians couldn't replicate this miracle. Yet still, Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrews go. Swarms of flies. Egypt was covered in swarms of flies, yet in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, no flies appeared. Still, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Death of livestock. All the livestock in Egypt died, but the Hebrews' cattle were spared. Pharaoh's heart didn't change. Painful boils. Boils broke out on every Egyptian, including Pharaoh's magicians. The pain was unbearable, yet Pharaoh still refused to listen. Fiery hail mixed with fire fell from the sky, destroying crops and trees, yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. Locusts descended, consuming every green plant in Egypt, leaving nothing but devastation. Yet Pharaoh's resolve only grew stronger. 3 days of darkness so thick that it could be felt. It covered Egypt for 3 days, yet the Israelites had light. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Death of the firstborn. This final plague was the most terrible of them all. Every firstborn in Egypt, from the Pharaoh's son to the lowest servant, would die. But God provided a way of protection for the Israelites. They were instructed to slaughter a lamb and spread its blood on their doorposts. That night, the angel of death passed over their homes, sparing their children. But in every Egyptian home, there was wailing and mourning as the firstborn died. Finally, Pharaoh, broken and terrified, summoned Moses and told him to leave Egypt. The Israelites were free, but the journey ahead was far from over. The Israelites, their hearts filled with both joy and fear, left Egypt in the dead of night. They had been slaves for 430 years, and now they were free. But they soon found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. Pharaoh, after the loss of his son and seeing his land destroyed, had a change of heart. He gathered his army and chased after the Israelites, determined to bring them back. As the Israelites stood before the vast sea, panic spread among them. "Why did you bring us here to die?" they cried to Moses. "Didn't we tell you in Egypt to leave us alone?" But Moses stood firm. His faith in God never wavered. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today," he declared. Then Moses raised his staff, and something incredible happened. The winds began to blow, and the sea split in two, forming walls of water on either side. A dry path appeared, leading the Israelites across to safety. Pharaoh's army pursued, but when the last of the Israelites reached the far shore, Moses stretched his hand over the sea again. The waters returned, drowning Pharaoh's army and ensuring the Israelites' safety. The people stood in awe. The God who had delivered them from Egypt had now saved them from destruction. Though the Israelites were free, their journey was not without trials. The wilderness stretched before them, an endless sea of sand, with no food, no water, and no comfort. But God had promised to lead them, and He was faithful. Water from the rock. When the people were thirsty, Moses struck a rock at God's command, and water poured out, quenching their thirst. Manna from heaven. When the people complained of hunger, God rained down manna, a type of bread, from heaven. It was sweet, like honey, and the people gathered it every morning. For 40 years, God provided this daily bread for them. Quail for meat. When the people yearned for meat, God sent quail to fill their camp. Despite the miraculous provisions, the people grew restless and rebellious. They questioned Moses' leadership and longed to return to Egypt. But Moses, though frustrated, always turned to God for guidance, and God continued to provide. While Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the people grew impatient. They began to question whether Moses would return. In their impatience, they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded that he make them a god to worship. Aaron, despite his faith, succumbed to their demands and fashioned a golden calf for them to worship. When Moses came down from the mountain and saw the people worshipping the idol, he was filled with righteous anger. He threw down the tablets of the 10 Commandments and shattered them. He then destroyed the golden calf and called for those who were faithful to God to come forward. The rebellion was harshly punished, and the people had to repent. Moses interceded on their behalf, asking God to forgive them. God, in His mercy, did not destroy them, but gave Moses new tablets, representing the covenant he had made with his people. As the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, they faced numerous challenges that tested their faith. Though they had witnessed God's mighty miracles, from the parting of the Red Sea to the provision of manna, each new obstacle seemed to cause them to question His faithfulness. Despite all that God had done for them, the people began to grumble. Their complaints grew louder, and their trust in God waned. The wilderness was harsh, with no food or water, and they began to doubt whether God had truly led them to freedom. The struggles of the people. One of the greatest tests came when the Israelites found themselves once again without water. They arrived at a place called Rephidim, but the water they found was bitter. The people began to grumble against Moses, accusing him of leading them into the wilderness to die of thirst. They demanded that Moses provide for them. Moses, overwhelmed with their complaints, cried out to God. And God, in His mercy, commanded Moses to strike a rock with his staff. When Moses obeyed, water flowed from the rock, and the people drank, but they still grumbled. Despite God's continual provision, the Israelites could not escape the temptation to complain and doubt his promises. Victory over the Amalekites. As the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness, they encountered a dangerous enemy, the Amalekites. The Amalekites attacked the Israelites without warning, and a battle ensued. Moses told Joshua to lead the men into battle while he stood on a hill, holding up his staff to God in prayer. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites were winning. But as his arms grew tired, the Amalekites gained ground. Seeing Moses' struggle, Aaron and Hur came to his aid. They provided a stone for Moses to sit on and held his arms up, ensuring the Israelites' victory. The battle ended with the Israelites victorious, and Moses built an altar to honor God, naming it, "The Lord is my banner." This victory was a clear reminder that the battle belonged to the Lord, and that the Israelites' success depended on their dependence on God. After the victory over the Amalekites, the Israelites camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses went up the mountain again, this time to receive the laws and commandments from God. God told Moses to remind the people of the covenant he had made with them. The Israelites were to be a holy nation, set apart for God's purpose. God spoke to Moses and gave him detailed instructions for the tabernacle, a place where his presence would dwell among them. God's glory descended upon the mountain in a cloud of smoke, and the people trembled in fear. But Moses, as their mediator, spoke to God on their behalf. During this time, Moses also received the 10 Commandments, the moral and spiritual laws that would govern Israel's relationship with God and each other. These commandments were foundational to their covenant with God and served as a guide for righteous living. The sin of the golden calf. Revisited. After Moses received the commandments and instructions from God, he descended the mountain to find that the people had once again fallen into sin. They had grown impatient and, once again, turned to idolatry. They had created a golden calf and were worshipping it in defiance of God's commands. Moses' anger burned as he saw the people's rebellion. He threw down the tablets, breaking them in his rage, and called the people to repentance. He commanded the Levites to stand by his side and take action against those who had led the people into sin. The Levites obeyed, and many of the idolaters were struck down. Moses then returned to the mountain, pleading with God to forgive the people. God showed mercy, but he also made it clear that those who had sinned would face consequences. Moses again ascended the mountain to receive new tablets of the law. This time, Moses' face shone with the glory of God, a visible sign of God's presence and favor. After the renewal of the covenant, the Israelites continued their journey toward the land God had promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They marched through the wilderness, guided by a cloud by day and fire by night, as they made their way to the borders of Canaan. But the journey was not without difficulties. The Israelites continued to test God, complaining about the food and water, and even questioning Moses' leadership. But each time they faced a challenge, God provided for them. In their need, he sent manna from heaven and quail to feed them. When they were thirsty, he brought forth water from a rock. And each time the people grumbled, Moses prayed, interceding on behalf of the people, and God, in his mercy, continued to provide. However, the Israelites' lack of trust in God had serious consequences. When they finally reached the borders of Canaan, the promised land, God instructed Moses to send 12 spies to explore the land. These 12 men were leaders from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. They spent 40 days scouting the land, taking in its beauty and the challenges ahead. When they returned, 10 of the spies gave a discouraging report. They described the land as filled with giants, mighty warriors, and fortified cities. "We are like grasshoppers in comparison to them," they said, spreading fear among the people. But 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, urged the people to trust in God's promises. "We can take the land," they declared, for the Lord is with us." But the people, swayed by fear, refused to listen to Joshua and Caleb. They wanted to return to Egypt, to the land of slavery, rather than face the challenges ahead. In their rebellion, the people doubted God's ability to fulfill His promise. At this moment, God's judgment was pronounced upon the people. He told Moses that none of the adults who had left Egypt would enter the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb. The Israelites would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had spent exploring the land. This was a harsh consequence for their lack of faith. Their journey, which could have taken only a few months, would now stretch into 40 years of wandering. The older generation would die in the desert, and only their children would inherit the land. The Israelites were devastated, but it was too late. God had spoken, and His will would be done. The people tried to change their minds and enter the land, but they were defeated by the Canaanites and forced to retreat. From that moment forward, the Israelites would face years of wandering, but God did not abandon them. During the 40 years of wandering, God continued to provide for His people. The Israelites were tested again and again, but God remained faithful. He led them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He gave them water from the rock and manna from heaven, and He ensured their clothes and sandals did not wear out. Despite their rebellion, God's presence was with them. But even though God's provision was constant, the people continued to test Him. One instance of their disobedience was when they complained about the manna. "We loathe this miserable food," they cried. In response, God sent fiery serpents to punish them. Many were bitten and some died. The people repented, and Moses interceded for them. God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Those who looked at it would be healed. This moment became a powerful symbol of God's mercy and healing power. As the Israelites drew closer to the Promised Land, Moses knew that his time was coming to an end. He had led the people through their trials and challenges, but now it was time for a new leader to rise. Moses called the people together and gave them a final address, reminding them of the importance of faith, obedience, and trust in God. He reaffirmed the covenant and encouraged the Israelites to remain faithful to God. He also appointed Joshua, his trusted assistant, to be his successor. Moses laid hands on Joshua, commissioning him to lead the people into the land that God had promised them. Moses, however, would not enter the promised land. God took him to the top of Mount Nebo and showed him the land. But He told Moses that he would die there. The Israelites mourned the loss of their great leader. Moses had been God's servant, the man who spoke face to face with God, and his legacy would live on in the faith of the people. Moses' death marked the end of an era for the Israelites. He had led them from slavery to freedom, from oppression to hope. Through his faith and obedience, Moses had become a powerful example of God's power and faithfulness. And now, as the Israelites stood on the edge of the Promised Land, they had to choose whether to continue in Moses' footsteps and trust God to bring them victory. With Joshua leading them, the Israelites crossed into the Promised Land, ready to claim what had been promised to their ancestors. The land was filled with challenges, but they were no longer slaves. They were free people, prepared to fight for the future that God had promised them. As the Israelites settled into the land, they faced many battles and challenges. But God was with them every step of the way, just as He had been with Moses. Under Joshua's leadership, the Israelites took possession of the land, defeating their enemies and establishing themselves as a nation. But the story of Moses is not just about the land, the battles, or the miracles. It is about faith. It is about the journey of trusting God, even when the path is uncertain, and standing firm in the face of fear and opposition. It is about the power of obedience to God's will and the legacy of a man who, despite his flaws and doubts, remained faithful to the calling God placed on his life. Moses' story reminds us that no matter how difficult the journey may be, God is always with us, guiding us, providing for us, and fulfilling His promises. The journey of Moses teaches us that even when we feel small, insignificant, or unworthy, God can use us to accomplish His great plans. After Moses' death, Joshua became the new leader of the Israelites, tasked with guiding them into the Promised Land. Although the people mourned Moses' passing, they had no time to waste. The land they were promised awaited, but it was not an easy road ahead. The Canaanites were strong, and the cities were fortified. However, God's plan for His people had not changed, and His promises remained intact. God spoke to Joshua, saying, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel." God assured Joshua that He would be with him, just as He had been with Moses, and He commanded him to be strong and courageous. Joshua had learned much under Moses' leadership. His faith was unwavering, and he knew that God was capable of doing the impossible. With the people's faith and trust in God, they began their conquest of Canaan. Joshua sent spies into the city of Jericho, one of the strongest cities in the land, to gather intelligence and find a way to conquer it. When the spies returned, they reported that the people of Jericho were terrified of the Israelites, for they had heard of the miracles God had performed for them, including the parting of the Red Sea. The Israelites' reputation had already begun to precede them, and it seemed that victory was within their reach. God gave Joshua specific instructions on how to take Jericho. He told them to march around the city once every day for 6 days, and on the 7th day to march around it 7 times. On the 7th time, the priests would blow their trumpets and the people would shout. When they did, the walls of Jericho would collapse. It was a seemingly impossible strategy, one that defied all logic. But Joshua obeyed God's instructions precisely. The Israelites did as God commanded, and on the 7th day they marched around the city 7 times. As the trumpet sounded and the people shouted, the walls of Jericho fell down, and the city was conquered. This miraculous victory showed the Israelites that God was with them. Their faith and obedience to His commands were rewarded. Jericho fell, and the Israelites had their first victory in the land of Canaan. After the victory at Jericho, the Israelites continued to conquer cities and nations within Canaan, but not without challenges. The people were constantly reminded of the covenant that God had made with their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had promised that He would give them this land, and He would be faithful to fulfill His promise. God instructed Joshua to renew the covenant with the people. In a ceremony that took place at Mount Ebal, Joshua reminded the people of their commitment to obey God's commandments. He read aloud all the words of the law, and the people pledged to follow them. The Israelites were to remain faithful to God, and in return, He would remain faithful to them. If they obeyed His commands, they would prosper in the land. If they turned away, they would face consequences. As the conquest of Canaan continued, God instructed Joshua to divide the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. The land was to be distributed by lot, with each tribe receiving its allotted portion. This marked the beginning of the Israelites' settlement in the land that God had promised them. The process of dividing the land was long and detailed. Each tribe received specific boundaries and territory, but the Levites, the priestly tribe, did not receive a specific inheritance of land. Instead, they were to be given cities scattered throughout the other tribes' territories, where they could minister to the people and teach them God's laws. As the land was divided, the people saw the fulfillment of God's promise. They had been slaves in Egypt, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they were finally receiving the land of their inheritance. Though the Israelites had conquered much of the land, the challenge of remaining faithful to God remained. The surrounding nations continued to pose a threat, and many of the Israelites were tempted to adopt the customs and gods of the Canaanites. This was a constant source of tension within Israel. God had commanded the Israelites to destroy the idols and altars of the Canaanites, to rid the land of all forms of idol worship. However, as time went on, some of the Israelites became complacent. They began to make compromises, tolerating the idolatry and sinful practices of the surrounding nations. This led to conflict within the nation. Joshua, knowing the dangers of disobedience, gathered the people together for a final speech. He reminded them of all that God had done for them, and he called them to choose whom they would serve. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," Joshua declared. This was a powerful declaration of his own commitment to God, and it challenged the people to make a choice about their own faith. In his final days, Joshua gathered the people one last time to reaffirm their covenant with God. He reminded them that God had been faithful to fulfill his promises and that they were called to remain faithful in return. He also warned them that if they turned away from God, they would face his judgment and the loss of their inheritance. After delivering his final charge, Joshua died at the age of 110. He had led Israel to victory, and under his leadership, the people had conquered much of the promised land. He was buried in the land of his inheritance, and the people mourned the loss of their faithful leader. Joshua's death marked the end of an era for Israel. The Israelites had entered the promised land, but their journey was far from over. They would face many more challenges, including the temptation to abandon God for the gods of the nations around them. But Joshua's legacy lived on as a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness and the importance of remaining faithful to him. Joshua's life serves as an example of courage, obedience, and leadership. He led the Israelites with strength and faith, trusting in God's promises even when the odds seemed impossible. His declaration, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," remains a call to all believers to remain faithful and dedicated to God. The stories of Moses and Joshua are full of powerful lessons that apply to our lives today. Both men faced incredible challenges, yet they trusted in God's promises and obeyed his commands. Through their faith and obedience, they were able to lead God's people to freedom and victory. 1. Faith in God's promises. Both Moses and Joshua trusted in God's promises even when the circumstances seemed impossible. Their faith was unwavering, and God rewarded them for it. 2. Obedience to God's commands. Throughout their lives, both men remained obedient to God's commands, even when it was difficult. Their obedience brought blessings, and their disobedience led to consequences. 3. The importance of leadership. Moses and Joshua were both strong leaders who guided the people through trials and victories. Their leadership was rooted in their faith and obedience to God. 4. God's faithfulness. Through every trial, God remained faithful. He fulfilled his promises, providing for his people and guiding them to the land he had promised them. 5. The call to serve God. Both Moses and Joshua made it clear that serving God is the most important decision we can make. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." As we reflect on the lives of Moses and Joshua, we are reminded of the importance of trusting in God's faithfulness, obeying his commands, and embracing the call to serve him wholeheartedly. The journey of the Israelites is a powerful reminder that God's plans for us are bigger than our fears and doubts, and that he is always faithful to fulfill his promises. If this story has inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Biblical Journey for more powerful Bible stories and messages of faith. Leave a comment below and share how the lessons from Moses and Joshua's journey have impacted your life. Stay connected with us as we continue to explore the stories of faith and God's incredible faithfulness throughout history. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of faith. Keep trusting in God's promises and remember that his faithfulness will never fail you.